I'm going to go pretty quickly, especially to start with, because I've got lots to cover, and apparently I've only got half an hour, or 25 minutes, depending on what Gene said. So I'm Gareth Rushgrove. I'm Gareth R pretty much everywhere on the internet. Apparently someone thinks I look like this. So I work for Puppet. We've got a booth downstairs in the hall, so do come and see us. I'm not going to talk really about automation, but if you want to talk about sort of configuration management, automation stuff later, I'm around. What I am going to talk about is my time in government and some of the sort of a bunch of stories from that time. So a little bit of a backstory. A lot of people will have heard some of this anyway. But I became a civil servant about 6 years ago, something crazy like that. So the Government Digital Service that lots of people have heard of, the GovUK project that lots of people have heard of. I was there before any of those had those names. I was about the 10th person, 15th person into that crazy group of people that became GDS. So GDS is the Government Digital Service. It's still going strong. I think there's at least one person in the room who works there at the moment. I think I spotted him back there somewhere. It's basically a unit of the Cabinet Office. It's responsible for a lot of the controls, a lot of money, a lot of how government does IT. It also has a bunch of people building stuff. And I did a bit of everything, sort of nearly a sort of typical early stage startup story, just I was inside government. I started there building a bunch of stuff, writing a bunch of code. I was sort of the person out of the first batch of people saying, if we're going to do this for real in a regulated environment, if we're going to be the biggest website in the UK government, there's loads of infrastructure and operations and information security work to do. And my colleague at the time said, okay, you do that then. I pointed out that was probably more work than one person. He said, I know, go find a bunch of people, hire a bunch of people, make a team, run that. I did that for a while. I then spent probably the next couple of years probably easily understood as doing internal consulting for government. I was a civil servant, I worked at the Cabinet Office, but I helped a bunch of different departments on their sort of IT transformation journeys. And sometimes I was the stick, and sometimes I was the carrot, and sometimes none of us know what was going on. And formally I was a technical architect, had a fancy job title. Now I'll come on to sort of maybe that later. I do want to say I'm no longer a civil servant, so some of this might be out of date. The stories will have undoubtedly got better, but hopefully they'll be familiar for people in other similarly messy organisations. But I do want to say shout out to anyone who is a civil servant, because everyone should do that. This talk is all about communication, it's about language, and it's about silos, and I'm going to try and draw a few things out. I'm going to try to do that by telling some stories, picking on specific bits, quoting some people in and out of context, and tying that back to, say, languages. I want to talk about stereotypes as well. And I'm going to try scatter throughout sort of just some tips, things that you can do in your organizations, and hopefully there'll be something for everyone. So, first thing I want to talk about is language. And I want to start that off by saying, appreciate that you're in a silo. I guess sort of people talking about DevOps often talk about silos. But actually, the people at the DevOps events nearly invariably think of themselves as outside that. Well, that's not me, that's them. I'm trying to bridge these silos or break these silos down. And I think it's important to realize that that's nearly never quite true, or at least it's never true 100% in any direction. And so I'm going to do some tests. I don't think we've got time to do loads of call-out stuff, but you see words like this, sort of containers and Scrum and serverless and cloud. And some people are probably thinking like, yep, that's my tribe, that's who I assign with. And I'd say that's probably a bunch of developers, or it might be more sort of people who are in a sort of delivery organization or a digital organization, depending on what words you're using. But definitely begins with a D. You're hearing those words all the time. Some of the rest of you probably more familiar with words like this. There's some people chuckling along. You're talking about COBIT and capacity management and configuration management and cabs. You probably are more aligned with an IT silo. For the security people in the room, you probably talk about cyber and kill chains and APTs. There's a prize if anyone can tell me what all of these are. There's an even bigger prize if that person's not from government. And I think it's sort of, people are sort of nodding, smiling, looking ahead. I think it's very clear that we build up languages around different disciplines. I mean, I've picked 4 here. You could probably just keep going. We build up lingo. The language and speech, especially the jargon, slang, or argot of a particular field, group, or individual. Your organization is composed of particular fields, particular groups, particular individuals, and they're all bringing their own language, and it becomes lingo, it becomes jargon, it becomes a barrier to entry. And one of the points I want to make is that in a large organization in particular, that language, that lingo, acts as a barrier to entry to those communities. If I want to go talk to the security group in my organization, and I don't know those words, or if I want to talk to central IT, I want to talk to the CIO sort of head office, then without an understanding of the words, without an understanding of the context, I don't need to be a COBIT expert. But if I don't know what it is, I'm probably going to get laughed at and pushed out and not be able to make my point, not be able to get my job done, whatever it was. Because those language differences reinforce the silos. They don't just prevent you sort of getting into them. They reinforce that fact that you're not part of that crowd. And so you start doing things yourself. A lot of things like shadow IT can become the fact that, well, it was easier to do it myself than have the people who are responsible for it to do it for me. Language is part of putting up those barriers to making that the case. So first tips, and I'll scatter these throughout, and have a go in your organization of identifying words that are only in use in one bit of it. It's really super interesting. And I think what you'll be able to observe is you'll be able to find the sort of seams between your organization. You'll be able to find silos in a way that's not just as simple as your organizational chart. One area that I did a bunch of work in inside government, I said I ended up being one of the first people into GDS that really sort of focused on infrastructure and operations. I did a whole bunch of work around, I guess, in between and on both sides at different times, the sort of agile software development methodologies and more traditional sort of service management inside a large organization. Within GDS, I like to start with, I mean, for the people that have sort of seen the material, sort of seen the award-winning stuff, seen the website, seen the sort of what people from GDS have and do talk about. Especially at the time, we definitely talked a lot about design. We talked about user research. We talked about Agile and open source. And a lot of that was fundamentally because they were very new to government. We weren't the first people to doing them, but we did have a podium, and we were doing them all together, and that was something we were trying to get government to do. We talked a lot about the discovery process. We talked a lot about doing sort of alphas and betas, doing small things quickly on small budgets to demonstrate that there really was a user problem and we knew what the solution might look like. We talked a lot about that, and you'll see that language throughout all the GDS stuff over the past 5 years. We hired a lot of software developers, fundamentally because actually government employed very few. It used a lot, but it employed very few, and we talked a lot about that. I think in hindsight, and to some extent not necessarily as a criticism, we didn't talk about operations. We didn't talk about the sort of infrastructure or running things. To some extent, to start with, that was because we weren't running anything. Ultimately, GDS was a brand new organization within the Cabinet Office. We were created to do a number of different jobs, but we weren't really running anything to begin with, not in a way that we wanted to sort of
espoused to the rest of government. But that had a knock-on effect. And one of the things I'd say is, like, when you're communicating, especially if you're part of a sort of transformation effort within your organization, don't just communicate and don't just talk about the things that you're trying to change. Talk about everything that you feel is part of that. Talk about the things that maybe are already being done well as the things you're actually working on today, and talk about the things you're going to want to be changing later, not just the things you want to change tomorrow. So one of the things was really that sort of words carry a weight of the sort of context, of past experiences and other organizations. So people make assumptions about the things that you're not talking about. And ultimately, those assumptions are going to be different for different people, different organizations, different times. And so unless you sort of talk about everything, you risk people getting the bit you're telling them, but assuming things about the things you're not. An example of this was sort of picking on one of my ex-colleagues was, this was very early in GDS, sort of, I guess, 50 people, 40 people, whatever. So I was there from, like, say, 10 to about 700, sort of quite a growth. But I think this was around launching the beta of GovUK, and one of my colleagues, quite a senior colleague at the time, suddenly was sort of like, we were going to go like live, and he was like, will the release work? And to an extent, I was like, that question makes no sense whatsoever. And I actually disappeared, checked something, came back and said, yes, it's going to work. We've done it more than 1,000 times now. I'm totally confident it works now. And the thing was a release had become something that I was sort of responsible for, but ultimately we were doing it so often, it was just background. It was just happening every day, all the time. It wasn't a big deal. The person asking the question, although they'd been actually fundamentally part of that team, they'd sort of not really got into the details to that level. And their background was from an organization where releases was something that you did everything to avoid. When they happened, they always went wrong. And then you went into a big meeting and cried a lot. And then you tried to avoid doing it again. And it's one word. And we had fundamentally different sort of views on it. One of the things, sort of observations, I guess, in hindsight, was sort of early members of GDS were from sort of media, startups, technology backgrounds. And one of the things that became clear as we sort of moved from being sort of agitators to being more sort of like adopting practices that were required by government mandate, by legislation, by whatever sort of assurance mechanisms were in place across government that affected everyone, was things like the formal language of service management was totally unfamiliar to most people within GDS organization. So the sort of comment at the bottom is which is ironic because ITIL was a creation of the UK government originally, but obviously then generationally these people had joined, and capitalism, so like service management was not something that the GDS people sort of the language they got, but it was familiar to government. But one of the things that was also true was, but the practices that we now sort of see aligned with sort of DevOps that really are addressing the problems that service management is all about were just second nature. We of course we were doing continuous delivery and deployment. Of course we were using automated configuration management tools. Of course we were doing these things. And ultimately, that's probably more true of organizations today than it was 5 or 6 years ago. But for us at that moment in time, this was second nature. But obviously that was totally different to how those problems had been solved previously in government. So one of the things, if you're going through a transformation, like realizing that you'll have different types of people probably as part of that maybe your organization has never had. And even if it's just a generational shift, that brings with it this sort of, people bring their own languages, their own assumptions about what things are. A good example of that is the sort of, one of the terms I use there around configuration management. and someone's having flashbacks to the front there. And we as part of GDS, as part of WK, we had a very robust configuration management strategy. And what I was doing later as part of the sort of more consultative stuff was sort of wandering around government. And I remember this conversation, I won't name the department, but someone said to me like, well, we cancelled our configuration management effort because we couldn't keep the spreadsheet up to date. They'd spent an awful lot of money, they'd spent a lot of time, and fundamentally they couldn't keep that spreadsheet up to date, and so they just gave up. The point they gave up was when the recommendation came back from the team running that project that instead of changing everything every quarter, if they changed everything every 6 months, they reckoned they could keep the spreadsheet up to date. And then at that point, their organization was like, honestly, maybe the spreadsheet can stay out of date and we'll ship faster. Like, if it's one or the other, we know which one we're doing. And I remember just simply being able to show what we were doing there. And because, again, it was second nature to myself and people who'd set up GovUK, set up GDS. Well, we knew the state of our infrastructure all the time on a sort of several orders of magnitude like difference that was like, well, no, that's not possible. How did you do that? And ultimately, we weren't doing anything new or novel. We weren't inventing technology here. We were simply using things that existed in a different context. But it was all the same word. It was all the same problem. It was configuration management. And again, like overlapping words from sort of different tribes, different generations are a great place to start collaboration. And from that conversation, it was able to sort of say, well, oh, yeah, no, we have a shared problem. But actually, we solved it and you didn't. But we solved it in a generationally different way. Finding overlapping words often means you can have a conversation that is otherwise difficult between those different silos, different groups, different languages. I'll grab some water. One of the other areas that I find super interesting when it comes to sort of communication, when it comes to silos, is that of stereotypes. Because I'd sort of say like a lack of personal relationships, and sometimes that is caused by language, sometimes it's caused by all sorts of other things, leads to stereotypes. It leads to caricatures. It leads to sort of, and the developer, not like Bob who works over there. And that makes it easier to sort of distance yourself and make fun of and go your own way. And that's what we're trying to resist with sort of that resistance to silos. A stereotype, I think most people are familiar, is sort of like a widely held but fixed and oversimplified version of the sort of person. But coming back to our sort of 4 groups earlier, we had the sort of the IT sort of group, the sort of the developer delivery digital side of things, maybe the security group, maybe the government group. I'll give people a few seconds to work out which ones they think it is. Sort of, who doesn't have like sort of a digital or a developer group that wants to use shiny new technology? Anyone familiar with government will be familiar with the incredibly hierarchical sort of structures leading to weird things like people saying, before you've done anything with them, what grade are you? And basically, like, it's a polite way of asking inside a government context whether they have to pay attention to you. And can you imagine going into a business meeting and saying like, oh, hi, yeah, do I have to pay attention to anything you say or not? Sounds impolite. Government has a polite way of saying it, which is still as crazy. IT might be asking about binaural IT. Security will probably be saying no. My guess is most people got all of those right. They are totally unfair. They're oversimplifications. But everyone probably got them right. Stereotypes are a way of us communicating that sort of, like, not quite right, but not quite not true information. We often talk about organisational silos, sort of like the org chart problem of like, oh, we created a development group and an operations group, and they fight because we told them to do different things. Who'd have thought it? I think that comes across in a number of the conversations earlier, and Jason's talk from Disney, for example. But lots of silos are personal. People like creating groups around them or aligning themselves with a tribe. And a lot of the sort of those silos come from cross-cutting disciplines that are not just like deeply organizationally structured. They're people. A good example of this is the sort of like somewhat infamous sort of bastard operator from hell, sort of the BOF. And the definition on the internet is a fictional rogue system administrator who takes out his anger on users and others who pester him with computer problems. The emphasis on fictional is mine, because as far as I'm concerned, as an operator occasionally, like, these people totally exist. And I think a few people I've shown this to have gone like, fictional? What? I think, and again, it's a stereotype. Again, we're being unfair. And some people will align with this character more and against it, and it gives us something to form boundaries around, and resisting that is useful. The reason I'm sort of talking about stereotypes is because by being aware of them, you can use them to your advantage to break down the barriers that they cause and have caused in your organization. Because if you're going in as I was in a number of cases, from the sort of, maybe the sort of, GDS was very much more aligned because we talked about it more, the sort of the developer digital side of things. A lot of what I did was actually going in to talk to departments, IT groups, often after some of my colleagues had been to see them and said crazy things. But I was able to go in with the knowledge that actually they were going to perceive me as this sort of crazy, young, like trendy, like sort of fancy technology, agile developer, nothing to do with production problem. If I could go in and play on absolutely the opposite of that stereotype, it's made people think. Part of that comes back to the language. Part of why I got interested in the topic of language was because in order to do my job, in order to break down that sort of, use that reverse stereotype, I had to be able to speak their language at least as well as they did. I had to become a domain expert in the things they did. One of those areas that I got sort of very involved in while I was involved in government, and still do a little bit now, was security. And one of the things I want to talk a little bit about is the sort of, I guess, the power of experts, but also the problems with intermediaries in sort of silos and organizations and change. Because there's definitely, I mean, it's not just me saying it, there is definitely a perception of sort of security says no. The internet is littered with quotes like this, and sort of, in my experience, InfoSec teams say no, and not why or suggesting alternatives. It's not helping, it's just slowing change. Again, I'm stereotyping, but this is pretty commonly held stereotype. Part of this, I think, comes down to expertise. Actually, the domain that we work in is incredibly broad. It requires a lot of expertise. And in lots of organizations, in lots of cases, we scale a sort of finite amount of expertise with paper. And I think security does this probably better or worse, depending on your viewpoint, than most other areas. It's the reams and reams of policy, often internal, often interpretive, as well as sort of regulation that sort of come into sort of information security work. The issue there is that you will have some expertise, but you're trying to scale it via paper, and in order to do that, you need middlemen. You need sort of intermediaries. You need someone to distribute the paper and be the sort of like at the coalface sort of version of that paper, because no one has enough time to read it all. And one of the things I'll say here is that sort of like, you break this down by having access to the actual experts. And one of the things I particularly enjoyed at government was like, I had a totally unfair advantage when it came to the sort of security side of things, because my security experts were GCHQ. Not everyone will have the same sort of go-to people in their organization, But you'll be surprised about having some, like a large organization, obviously we heard from sort of Barclays and Zurich and the like this morning, we'll have some very, very smart, very, very domain-specific experts. If you know who they are, you don't necessarily have to simply, you're not going to have to be the expert, but you need to, like, if you know where they are, you can often ask them. So again, one of my sort of like stories from my time in government. So GPG 13 was Good Practice Guide 13 for non-government people. Basically, a set of documents written not by people who wrote very well on topics that they fundamentally understood, but communicated in a sort of not in a prescriptive manner to a load of middlemen who then distributed the knowledge. This turned into lots of policy wonk arguments between technical people and interpreters of the documents. They invariably went like this, and I said I'm totally unfairly paraphrasing here, but like this definitely totally happened. I think you'll find that you can't do that because of my interpretation of this wording in GPG 13. Anyone who's had any sort of dealings with auditors has probably been through something like that. The difference here being the person saying this isn't actually the auditor. They don't get to decide anything. They're just interpreting a document from another expert. My response would have been something like this. Fair enough. But I think I like, let's have a different opinion. Let's ring Richard at GCHQ and see what he thinks. Well, because they wrote the document. They're the domain experts. Invariably at that point, the middlemen will freak out. In my experience, which is good fun, because invariably, like, you get access to the expert. The expert may or may not agree with you, but you're bypassing this inertia in the middle. Don't let the scarcity of expertise lead to unapproachable stereotypes. A lot of that wasn't that intermediary couldn't actually also contact that person. They actually had an entire network which allowed them to contact the same people. They might not have the same personal relationships, but they could totally contact those people. It was that, well, no, they're important. They're busy. They'd made themselves unapproachable. So the documents became tablets in stone, interpreted by middlemen, and suddenly you have all sorts of knock-on effects. Don't let scarcity of expertise. You will have experts. Make sure people know how to contact them directly. And I think that often helps it stops certain types of silos emerging in the first place. One of the areas that we took advantage of a lot within GDS, and you see as a pattern in lots of sort of organizations that have successfully adopted sort of various DevOps practices, is using sort of code as a way of facilitating communication. And as a sort of quick example of that, the dreaded incident severity conversation. I'm sure lots of people have had that conversation where you get in a room with different stakeholders from different parts of the delivery organization, the running operation, the business parts of things, and you come up with arbitrary words and arbitrary meanings for things like, oh, well, no, I think that's a P1. Well, I'm not sure. What about the matrix from our different suppliers? They have a look. Oh, excellent, they have a table. So do the other supplier. Oh, they're different. Oh, now we need lots of people have been there. It's great fun. Stage one of that meeting goes something like this. Everyone thinks everything is critical. That's all that. Everything is the most important. Any type of problem that you can have is the most type of problem you can have. Job done. Obviously, that's not very useful. So stage two so you convince people that that's not very useful. Stage two is basically, actually some things are less important, but anything to do with my service is completely important. The issue here is that it's all about semantics, it's all words, it's all language. Well, I mentioned sort of critical and Sev 1 and priority 1. They're all just made up. They don't generally have a mapping to anything in the real world. Apart from maybe sort of support levels or money back. Well, having something that is much more aligned with the actual running thing is more important. So one of the things we did at WK that's still in use, as far as I know, was basically a whole series of high-level smoke tests. And these were just computer tests written at a very high level to test like the entire system. But one of the things we did was you could tag them. By default, they would run, and by default, they would alert people. But you could tag them in such a way that that was the discussion point. That was whether something would ultimately page someone, get someone out of bed, or whether it would trigger various different SLAs. But it was in code. It was like the actual test was aligned with the SLA. And suddenly all the conversation happened around in one place, not some of it in a meeting, some of it in code, some of it on the system, some of it with this supplier or other. You're putting it all in one place. You're also avoiding the ambiguity of human language. Language is lossy. Computer code can be buggy, can do the wrong thing, but it shouldn't be ambiguous. It's going to execute, it's going to do something. The computer is ultimately the arbiter of whether something is ambiguous or not. There's loads of opportunities for taking this approach. And the internet is scattered with different ideas. A few I've picked out, and this was after I left GDS, but they did a bunch of work around acceptance testing for their content distribution network. And what's interesting here is that they can go to suppliers and say, well, are you conformant with our requirements? And their requirements are not a 100-page document that someone has to discern the tea leaves and work out whether it's like what that means. It's a test suite you can run against your product and say, well, does it pass or not? So like it nearly impacting sort of procurement and supplier selection via moving a bunch of that ambiguity into code. BDD security is a security tool for like describing tests in code. And Puppet, I mentioned, I work there, is sort of for infrastructure management. So I've got a few slides left. I think I'm over time, but I'll keep going. Where possible, combine like policy with implementation. Bring these things together. Don't have the sort of the ivory tower and the people who do stuff. It only ends in bad blood. So, concluding at the end, try and share language as much as possible in lots of different directions, not just between business units, but between different disciplines, different types, the different organizations. The more you can do that, the better. Because sharing language makes shared tooling and processes easier. The more you're sharing tooling, the more you're sharing processes, the less you're spending on recreating those wheels in different parts of your organization. You also get advantages of being able to move between different parts of your organization much more seamlessly. Again, all of these things are pushing down cost. Learn, and like if your organization has all those problems, it has all those silos, one of the best ways I've found of starting to break them down is learning that identify the different tribes, learn the language of one of them, and use that in order to change your organization. So I was asked by Gene to put something like I think there's a tradition for DevOps Enterprise of sort of having an ask. And one of the things that I haven't covered, and I don't know how to know, but I think is a great question for this community, is I've talked about patterns to sort of address silos in your organizations, because most of us work in organizations that exist. But what macro-organizational structures could we have in place that limit the emergence of those silos in the first place? And with thinking about that, that's me done, and thank you for listening.